Good morning. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us, or afternoon or evening, wherever you are. Really appreciate you being here. This is our event, Global Perspectives on AI Policy, How to Further Global Cooperation. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Courtney Lang. I'm our Senior Director of Policy on the Trust Data and Technology team at the Information Technology Industry Council and lead a lot of our global work on artificial intelligence. So I'm really pleased to be here moderating a panel of experts from around the world today. We'll get started in just a minute. I just wanted to take a moment to let everyone know that this event is being recorded. It's also open to the public, so just keep that in mind. A couple of notes on format as well. I'll provide just a few brief opening remarks for context to kind of set the stage for our conversation today. From there, I will allow our panelists to provide 5 minutes of brief opening remarks, and then we will move into a moderated discussion. I will lead the moderated discussion, ask questions of the panelists, and then we will also have time at the end for any audience questions. So if you do have a question and you are in the audience, if you could please use your chat function in Zoom and put your question in the chat. I will be checking that throughout our conversation today, and hopefully we will be able to address those questions towards the end of our conversation. So with that, I will just give some really brief context setting remarks, and then I will turn it over to our panelists from there. So one of the reasons we're holding this event today is that we continue to see governments around the world thinking about how to approach AI and really considering how to also tackle some of the challenges or issues that are associated with the increased use of artificial intelligence, like bias. We're seeing questions around high-risk AI use cases, around enforcement of particular regulatory proposals, things like that. So really looking forward to dive into some of those issues today. We've brought together this group of panelists to really discuss how they are thinking about these important questions and further explore how we may be able to work together across jurisdictions to really facilitate compatible or aligned policy approaches to artificial intelligence. That's very important for facilitating innovation and making sure that technology can thrive across borders. So let me just briefly introduce our panelists, and then I will turn it over to our first one to give opening remarks. So we have Elham Tabasi with us today. She is Chief of Staff of the Information Technology Laboratory from the U.S. National Institute of Standards and Technology. We have Juha Heikkilä, I am so sorry if I did not pronounce your name properly, the Advisor for Artificial Intelligence with the European Commission. We have Yoichi Ida, Deputy Director General for G7 and G20 Relations with the Ministry of Internal Affairs and Communications in Japan. And we will hopefully at some point soon have Jose Gontijo from the Brazilian Ministry of Science, Technology and Innovation also joining us. And we're just hoping that he is able to get on the platform soon. So with that, Elham, why don't I turn it over to you? We'll hear from you first about the activities that Nist is undertaking, and then we will move to Juha after that, followed by Yoichi, and then finally we'll go to Jose. So Elham, over to you.
Thank you, Courtney. Thanks everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending where you are logging in. And I'm delighted to be here among world leaders and experts to talk about this important issue. So I'm going to start by saying a few things about Nist. Many of you may know Nist, but we consider ourselves as industry's national laboratory. And Nist has a very broad portfolio of research. We do everything from building the world's most precise atomic clock to working collaboratively with industry to develop standards for use of robots in smart manufacturers and helping firefighters better prepare for and predict the behavior of wildfires. Also investigating the building codes and why buildings collapse, as our experts are now doing it with the Surfside buildings in Miami. Nist has a long-standing reputation for cultivating trust in technology by participating in development of standards, development of the metrics, both domestically and internationally, particularly standards that strengthen measurement science and make technology more secure, usable, interoperable, and reliable. In other words, more trustworthy. And we all know that this work is very critical in the AI space to ensure public trust and confidence of this technology. We believe that the scientific and research innovations in all emerging technology, but particularly AI, have the potential to uplift and empower all people. Yet the use of AI technologies could have risks to individuals, organizations, or societies. And globally, researchers, developers, consumers all have expressed their desire and need to understand the technical and social risks related to AI and use of AI in society. And while the policy landscape that governs this area will continue to evolve across borders, here at Nist, we are working on to provide scalable research-based methods to assess risks and advance trustworthy approaches to responsible use of AI that serve all people in responsible, equitable, and beneficial ways. So one particular activity that I want to talk about today is that the launch of a consensus-driven, open, transparent, and collaborative process to develop an AI risk management framework. We had a request for information out, and we are grateful to many of the comments that we received. We invite and encourage active engagement of our national and international stakeholders and collaborators in this process. And that's an extension of our commitment to strengthen US technological leadership based on our shared democratic values. In addition to open and transparent and consensus-driven, that's one of the attributes of the AI risk management framework, we're also trying to provide common definitions, ensuring some degree of harmony in the terms used to talk about AI and AI risk is, we believe, is one way that we can promote innovation and adoption of AI. So we have done, we have stood up some foundational research in AI focusing on how to measure and enhance trustworthy and responsible AI. You may have seen a series of the documents and a series of the workshop that we have held around this topic, a document on managing bias in AI. The public comment period closed 10 days ago. And we had also some research going on understanding secure AI, explainable AI, and also measurement of the AI. I'm going to close by saying a few words about AI technical standards. We all know that technology standard development is increasingly an area of global strategic and economic competition. International standards help overcome trade barriers and expand market access, enabling small, medium-sized, all sizes enterprises access to market and supporting global economic growth. In US, we have the role, and I wear that hat as a federal AI standard coordinator, that we work across all the government, and we work very closely with our industry stakeholders to identify critical standard development activities, strategies, and gaps. Our role at Nist and government is to help standard development of the standards and guidelines. And while standard is part of our name, we are not really standard setting organizations. We develop guides and participate in development of the standards. That includes convening and joining with others to draft standards, guidelines, and most importantly, provide technical contributions to development of technically sound, scientifically valid, fit for purpose standards. I'm going to pause here. Look forward to hear from my panelists and the discussions that follows.
Great, thank you, Elham. Yuha, why don't we turn it over to you?
Thank you very much indeed. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a great pleasure and honor to be a member of this panel and join the company and to explain a bit what we do in the European Union in this regard. So first, maybe a couple of words, as Elham said, about Nist, also about the European Commission. So the European Commission is, if you like, the part of the European Union set up, which is in charge of initiating legislation and enforcing legislation on the one hand, but it is also a funding agency. So the European Commission does have a significant research and innovation funding program, which it is also in charge of, and I will be referring to that also presently. So What have we been doing in this area recently? Why are we engaging? Well, we are engaging simply because we think it's a very important area. AI is future technology, and it has a great deal of potential and promise for us. It also comes with some concerns and risks that, in our view, will need to be taken into account. In 2018, we published our first policy document on artificial intelligence, so-called communication, as we call them, where we outlined our comprehensive approach to AI. So we want to address, and we see the need to address, not just simply the technological aspects of artificial intelligence, but also the non-technological aspects of artificial intelligence. So this paper outlined the three pillars that are still key to our artificial intelligence approach, which is to address the research and industrial excellence and capacity in artificial intelligence in the European Union, to also address the socio-economic aspects and consequences of artificial intelligence. So this would be the labor market impacts and such like, and also then to ensure an appropriate legal and ethical framework for the development, deployment, and use of artificial intelligence. And we have continued then in this strand over the years, and most recently the published documents that are relevant in this regard are, on the one hand, the so-called coordinated plan on artificial intelligence, which is something that we have worked together with the European Union member states. And this has set a number of key policy objectives for our work in artificial intelligence in Europe. So we want to make sure that we have the right enabling conditions for the development and uptake of artificial intelligence in the European Union. We want to make sure that we have in the European Union excellence in artificial intelligence all the way from the lab to the market. We want to also make sure that this technology works for the people, and this then relates, of course, to the ethical and legal side. And we want to build a strategic leadership in a number of sectors, which include, for example, health, climate and environment, robotics, agriculture, and so on. And maybe just a few words about the activities we do on research and innovation and deployment. So we have a so-called framework program on research and innovation, and through that, plus also a more deployment and capacity building oriented program, we want to invest about 1 billion euros per year from the European Union level in artificial intelligence. And this includes then basic and applied research into artificial intelligence, different aspects of it. It also involves includes the bringing together of the different kinds of stakeholders, academia and industry. So we have set up a public-private partnership in artificial intelligence, data and robotics. We also want to make sure that the research translates into marketable products. So we have plans to set up testing and experimentation facilities to help companies bring their innovation onto the market and to bridge the gap, if you like, between the lab and the market. So these are activities that we support through our funding programs in our role as a funding agency in the European Union. And of course, we have then a longer term target in the European Union of increasing the investment in artificial intelligence to 20 billion euros per year, public and private investment included by the end of this decade. So that's on the more, let's say, research, innovation, technology aspects. But then we have also now recently, of course, published our proposal for a legal framework on AI, so-called AI Act, as it's called, where we define a risk-based approach to AI. And it defines and categorizes risk in a certain way, starting from low or no risk artificial intelligence systems, where there are no further requirements, or potentially some transparency requirements in the case of low risk cases. Then we have high risk cases where we have where we provide for an ex-ante conformity assessment, which comes with certain requirements regarding data, for example, transparency, human oversight, etc. And then we have a small number of uses of AI, which in this proposal are planned to be completely prohibited because they are not considered to be in line with the values and fundamental rights that we have in the European Union. So this is the kind of approach that that has this pyramid-like shape, if you like, which has the top tip of the pyramid with the prohibited use of AI. So, for example, subliminal manipulation, exploitation of children or mentally disabled persons, general purpose social scoring, and remote biometric identification for law enforcement purposes in publicly accessible as places. And then the high risk use cases are a bit broader category, and then of course the large majority of cases where there is no particular where there are no particular requirements. And in order for products to be placed on the EU market, this conformity assessment process will have to be gone through for those products which are in this high risk category. I should point out that this does not target AI as such, but certain uses of AI based on the risk that is there. And then the measures are geared towards that risk accordingly. So this is the kind of, if you like, the rationale of the proposal we have. The status as such is that this proposal is now in the so-called in the political process. So it is being debated by the European Parliament, and it will be discussed by the European Union member states. And in line with the proposal, the way that legislation is adopted in the European Union, it will be then adopted by the European Parliament and the Council of the member states, based on the proposal of the Commission and potential amendments that result from this process. So I'll stop there now. Thank you very much indeed for your attention.
Thank you. Really appreciate that overview. I think that's incredibly helpful. Yoichi, why don't we go to you next, and then we'll close out the opening remarks with Jose.
Well, thank you, Courtney. It's a pleasure to be here. Good to see my colleagues from Japan, from US, and also from the association. Well, here in Brazil, we are running the AI strategy for a while. We hired a specialist consultant to evaluate the market, evaluate the international benchmarking, and then we prepare a document that we put in public consultant last year, and then we launched this year the national strategy for AI. It is split in axes that will get legislation, regulation, ethical usage, governance, international aspects, and passing through education, training, capacity building, R&D, how to transform the knowledge and revenue, and also a specific application on prioritized areas that we have prioritized in the National Digital Transformation Strategy and the National IoT Plan. There are industry, health, cities, and agribusiness, and getting all those documents, we set this public policy, and at the end of the day, we start to promote projects to invest and to prepare the ecosystem in Brazil. So we set startup projects to how to engage startups with the R&D centers, and then when they evaluate the project, we ask for big companies that would like to test, to make some kind of sandbox and implement those AI projects on their company. We are in this phase, it's 11 million reais project. We launched also in the beginning of the year, and we have already selected 6 reference centers that we will receive at least 2 million reais per year during 10 years to support the AI reference center on those prioritized areas. We are up to launch the second call that will select 2 more, one in government application, another one in public safety. And we are preparing that we figured that doing that, we bring the stakeholders and get them closer, putting money and seed money and try to organize the ecosystem in Brazil. When we launched this specific call, all the main stakeholders in Brazil applied to the call. And we had it's very good because we map everyone, but at the end of the day, we have to hire international judges to evaluate the projects, because it could be some interest conflict. So we try to do that. And today we are discussing with the Parliament, with the congressman, a bill of law that probably will be voted next week on Tuesday, regarding the AI guideline milestone, let's say like that, that will give some principles, some guidelines, some directions on how to use, how to regulate or not to regulate at the end of the day, and to give the opportunity to the innovation happens and so on. We are discussing very closely. The congresswoman that's in charge of the report is Deputada Luisa Canziani. It's a very engaged. She's the leader of the digital parliament front that deal with the digital economy in Brazil. So we are working a lot with her, and probably will be approved in the low chamber on Tuesday. Then it goes to the upper chamber. And then that's what we are doing in Brazil. We are working on the international association, international groups such as GPI, such as OECD, such as Latin America groups. So we are very glad that you're here with you today. We have the US Digital Dialogue, we have European Union Information Society dialogue also. That's a very, very long cooperation that we have with Europe, including I will have a meeting with the representatives of them today. So we are trying to do the best practice and try to engage with the international ecosystem to move forward in the best usage of AI in Brazil. Thank you.
Thanks, Jose. And then Yoichi, over to you. Oh, can you unmute yourself, Yoichi?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, great. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody from Tokyo. My name is Yoichi Ida, Deputy Director General for G7 and G20 relations. And I'm also serving as a chair at the OECD Committee on Digital Economy Policy. So this time, let me briefly look back at the small history of international discussion on AI policy over the last several years. Because we recognize, Japan was one of the earliest countries who proposed international discussion on AI development and AI policies. And we proposed the discussion on AI principles in year of 2016 when we had the G7 presidency. And at that time, the idea was we expected huge impacts would be brought by this powerful technology onto economy and the whole society. And the discussion should be needed at international phases because AI systems would work across borders, across networks, and the impact would be easily go beyond borders. So our proposal was made at ministerial meeting of G7, and the basic question was how we could build up the trust to the AI technology among citizens, among developers, among service providers, and also all other relevant players and actors in the whole society. And at the same time, we didn't want to lose enabling environment for innovation, and we didn't want to hinder potential for growth brought by the technology. So as many of you may know, the discussion followed mainly in the two tracks, one in G7 and followed by G20, which are governmental policy forums. And the other one is in OECD, again, governmental forum, but with some instrument with wider participation from multi-stakeholders and also with the capacity to continue multi-year research and analysis. In G7 and G20, the presidency revolves each year, and the discussion may interrupt year by year. But at OECD, the discussion and the study could be continued, and they have very strong, powerful secretariat with many experts. So we had in OECD AI principles in the year of 2019, and the principles were also supported by G20 in the same year. So at that point, the next challenges for policymakers for us became how to implement these principles. These principles are based on human centricity and the values of democracy. So we wanted to know how to expand the adherent countries and the stakeholders, and at the same time we wanted to know how to implement these high-level principles into the practical implementations. So after 2020, I believe we see different wider variation of efforts are made in various tracks, including OECD itself. I believe OECD and the global partnership on AI are mainly promoting gathering good practices and learning from each other, and also trying some experimental projects or sandboxes, mainly focusing on soft law approaches. In the meantime, EU and the Council of Europe seem to be pursuing more regulatory approaches with a stronger focus on binding regulation in the field of AI. And some private standardization groups, such as ISO or IEC, are also trying to formulate some technical standards to implement those high-level principles. And I believe Nist is working very closely with those groups. And UNESCO is also discussing ethical principles to share those principles with developing countries. So all these efforts, I believe, are looking in the same direction of how to implement human-centric and trustworthy AI into the every corner of society and on the global basis, but just trying some different approaches. And from the very beginning, I believe these efforts must be promoted with multi-stakeholder approach, although those discussions were started at the governmental forum. And actually, we see all of those efforts are made in a multi-stakeholder way, in some way or another. Back in Japan, we are also trying to find ways to implement these principles, and the discussions are going on with the multi-stakeholder approach. And we are trying to pursue how to govern AI for better development and deployment in the society. And our general understanding is, at least as far as I understand, it is still too early to introduce binding regulation on this rapidly developing, changing technology. And now Japan is keeping soft law approach, at least in the center of our governance framework. Of course, we wouldn't deny the necessity of binding regulation in the future, but our expert regard it's a little too early to understand this technology completely, and also those regulations should be strictly risk-based and precisely focused. So I personally feel those regulations should be sector-specific rather than horizontal. In order to develop enabling and proportionate AI governance framework, we are trying to pile up in Japan use cases and gather good practices, so that we could understand how to mitigate risks and maximize the benefit. So from that point of view, this type of international exchange are very much useful for us, and I look very much forward to the discussion today. Thank you very much.
All right, well, thank you, Yoichi, and thank you all of our participants here today for providing those opening remarks. We'll launch into a conversation now, and maybe Juha, I can start with you. I think, there are a lot of eyes on the European Union and what's happening there right now, particularly with the proposal that's being debated in Europe. And you mentioned, this idea of ex-ante conformity assessment and conformity assessment for some of these high-risk AI use cases more generally. And I think one of the areas that we're particularly interested in learning more about is, kind of recognition of testing across jurisdictions and how one undertakes that, particularly when this field is still new and emerging, and there aren't necessarily commonly accepted practices to do that testing, right? And really avoiding overburdening local infrastructure with doing the testing. So was curious if you could share how the EU is thinking about this, and if the EU is thinking about, how they might recognize testing outcomes from third countries. And then maybe I can ask a question of panelists more broadly about how this might work across jurisdictions.
Right, thank you. So the proposal as such, the AI Act, the proposal for regulation does not specifically take a stand on this, doesn't specifically address this particular point. Of course, in the first instance, any products, AI products that are placed on the EU market would have to comply with the legislation once it's in force, which of course it isn't yet. But once it's in force, that would have to be the case. And if there are no recognized, acknowledged, and accepted testing and certification procedures, we should probably say, elsewhere, then obviously the providers would have to do the certification in the European Union. But this is as such an open question at the moment. What, however, happened with the General Data Protection Regulation was that some countries outside the European Union have then adopted legislation which guarantees, provides similar guarantees to what is then in force in the European Union. In terms of that particular piece of legislation. So Canada, for example, and Japan have adopted measures, legislative measures and national laws, which have then been recognized by the European Union, acknowledged to be sufficient, adequately similar to what is in force in the European Union in terms of the General Data Protection Regulation. And therefore, this enables free flow of data, for example, between Japan and the European Union. So this is obviously a win-win situation for both parties, because it would simplify exchanges and trade. And this makes it possible then for this bigger area to work together. So this is an example from that particular part of legislation, which could also work for this case. Now, of course, this is all open. As I said, this has not been discussed yet, because we don't have the legislation yet in the first place. That still takes some time, but that has provided an interesting example how it could work in practice, and how it is working in practice with a number of partner countries already. And it has obvious benefits, and we are of course very open to working with partner countries to make this happen.
I appreciate that answer. Yeah, I recognize it's still early days, and there's a lot of things that still need to be figured out, particularly as the legislation is being debated. But I do think because it does introduce kind of this new idea, it is important to start thinking about that, and it's helpful to hear, of examples where you have worked on this previously and ported in some outside results, for example. Yoichi or Jose, do you have any thoughts about how this might work, or how you might see this working across jurisdictions? totally fine if not. Was just curious if you had any perspectives you wanted to share.
Thank you very much for the question. Yes, I fully agree to Yuka. And we have a very good example of privacy protection. And in the beginning, we saw a difference, gaps between the two legal frameworks. But after the communication and the discussions, we reached an agreement of adequacy recognition mutually. And I think in the area of AI regulation, I personally feel that different countries, regions have to have different frameworks anyway, because we have different conditions and histories, cultures. Everything is different, and we need a different social requirements from the people. But on the other side, we need a kind of interoperability between the different frameworks and systems. So the communication and the mutual understanding is very important, and we need, for example, some people from our industry are a little bit worried that we do not have clear understanding in the definition of some elements in the proposed EU regulation. For example, some the safe protection systems or whatever, even the definition of AI itself. So we need to have a good communication to foster mutual understanding, and I believe we could reach an interoperability between the different systems. Thank you very much.
Yeah, so I agree that it's challenging. When you think about UE, I guess you have a governance that permits a more fluid discussion regarding this. But when we think about different administrations, such as Brazil, Europe, Brazil, US, Brazil, Japan, and so on, what I think that this should be done is the same that we did with data protection, previous data protection, that we had GDPR, Brazil, in our case specifically, we discuss a lot with UE, discuss with US, discuss with other countries, and at the end of the day, we have our GDPR that we call LGPD. It's not the same of the GDPR, but there are many things that are very similar. So I guess this international engagement will provide this harmonization at least very closely. But we don't have to take it on mind that there are national legislations. We have a national regulation for other areas. So an AI that at the end of the day makes some car crash. There is the national legislation for transit so we have to set the minimal requirements that it will permit the technology will be used. But I guess we always have some national specificities that must be accomplished also. So, but I guess this international engagement with experience that we had, for instance, as I mentioned, the GDPR, will harmonize at least a little bit what should or shouldn't not be. Thank you.
Courtney, can I come in?
Absolutely. Yep.
I apologize for the interruption. We had a thunderstorm here and the power went out, and I should have been on a laptop, so that's battery hadn't. So sorry for the interruptions and change of the scenery. But I missed about 2 minutes of the discussions. But on the topic of right, so what we're doing at Nist and in the OS with the risk management framework, with development of the risk management framework, is to develop first a lexicon language to communicate risk in a way that's interoperable. So we are all using the same language, so we are not talking past each other. And then develop a resource center of standards, and certainly globally developed standards in different international SDOs, and tools benchmarks, test bed for understanding, for identifying, understanding, examining risks. So what we're trying to do is that, again, to give the vocabulary language, what are the risks? Bring the whole community on a shared understanding of what each of those risks mean. Study the interplay of those, so we all agree on characteristics such as accuracy, avoiding bias, explainability, privacy, security, and all this. Study the interplay of this, but the whole point of this is to provide this resource center to all AI actors, designers, developers, implementers, evaluators, policymakers, so they can have in a very interoperable and aligned way, have a discussions about risk. But at the end of the day, the decision about what level of risk is acceptable to that particular application, that particular use case, we think is up to the owner of the application. Now, depends on the role you have, it's designer, developer, or users, or implementer, to do the trade-off between the cost and benefits and come to the right conclusion. So we are trying to say that there is no one size fits all for all of these things, and we have to, again, the goal is to bring everybody to be able to use the same lexicon, the same tools, and just here also I want to highlight the importance of having international standards developed in forums such as Yoshida-san talked about SC42 and IEEE and OECD, to align with them and have standards developed there so that the risk management framework can point to them and build more of these tools on identifying, measuring, and ultimately managing risk. One other thing that I would just say, and two other things that I say quickly, is that we had, as I said, a request for information for the development of the risk management framework, and everything that I said is sort of validated or confirmed with many of the comments that we received for the risk management framework. And I forgot the other thing that I wanted to say, so I just stop here.
No problem. Yeah, thank you. So another, area that a couple of you mentioned is this idea of risk, and certainly in the AI Act, there are low risk, high risk, and then outright applications that are banned. I think, though, as we see more governments thinking about risk and figuring out what specific uses may pose a higher risk than others, it does seem like an area that could be ripe for divergence across jurisdictions. And I know, Ilham, you just said there is no kind of one size fits all, and really the determination of what risk is acceptable depends on the designer, the developer, et cetera. But I would be curious to hear, how is each of your governments thinking about high risk use cases? Obviously, I'm most familiar with the EU proposal and how high risk has been characterized there. But I do think, one of the risks to utilize that language that we run in thinking about developing this kind of definition, if you will, of high risk AI use cases is that different countries or governments use different criteria to categorize high risk. So would be curious to hear panelists' thoughts about, are there certain criteria that you think could be applicable across jurisdictions to constitute high risk, and what might those be, if there are some that might be particularly relevant across jurisdictions?
May I, Courtney?
Yes, please.
In Brazil, we have a little bit different approach. Of course, you have to think about the risks. In any technology, any policy, you have to do that. But when someone wants to implement some technology, no matter where, no matter what kind of technology, we have the regular regulation, let's say like that, regular regulation on each area, on health, on transit, on cities, on energy, on cyber security, and so on. At the end of the day, the individual, the company, or the institution, we assume the risk to implement any kind of technology, such as AI. Okay, and there are the rules. If they do some mistake, they will be punished by that, and so on. We do believe that in this first moment, we should avoid to set out this is risk, you should or shouldn't not. What you're doing, we're monitoring that. And of course, we have to take care on some applications, such as health applications. It could be very, very complex if you have a wrong diagnosis or some AI define or some biases that will discriminate someone. And well, this kind of thing you have to monitor and see what's happening. But we have to think that we have to avoid, such as that film Minority Report, to start to punish the people, start to punish the companies just before it starts to have the real problem, because we really don't know what will happen. It's a very new technology. So of course you have to set the risk, but have to set the risk, and the risk had already been monitored in each area. If you're put AI on your house in a Alexa or a Google Home, it's different than you put AI in an intensive unit in a hospital monitoring the patients. And in this specific case, in the health area, there are rules, there are the confidence of the physicians, there are the responsibility of the professionals on which technology they will use on that. If it's AI, it's on a camera, it's on a heart monitor. I guess have to take care in this first early moment to avoid to stop the innovation, the implementation of the technology. But because there are the legislation to civil protection, the citizen protection. So that's our perspective.
If I may, I just want to echo what Jose said about, for example, voice recognition. If I'm using it at home from Alexa to order something, has a different level of risk rather than if voice recognition is being used in as Jose said, in a hospital setting for some indications through the health. And so both of them are voice recognition. We can put same example for face recognition. So how it's going to be used, for what application it's going to be used is important. And when I said one size fits all, that's what I meant.
So if I may comment, so that's precisely, in fact, the rationale of the EU AI Act. So it's the use which counts, and different kinds of use pose different kinds of risks. So it's not the technology of voice recognition, for example, as such, or face recognition as such, but it is the use that it's put to. And that's why it takes this approach that is based on the use rather than technology itself. As regards then perhaps the more general question, so from our perspective, the starting point was that the risks are of two kinds. There are risks to safety on the one hand, and there are risks to fundamental rights. Now, the fundamental rights aspect is something, it's a concept that's based on the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights, but it enshrines, for example, the European Convention on Human Rights, or includes the rights that are there. So it's, if you like, includes the human rights aspect, which is of course a very international concept. So those are the kinds of aspects that are based on the basis of the risk-based approach that we have. Now, of course, the interpretation of what is high risk and the decision of what is high risk may vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, of course. But on the other hand, these kinds of aspects that we have taken as the basis here could perhaps be seen similarly in jurisdictions which take overall a similar approach to AI in terms of human-centric trustworthy AI, which is supposed to serve for the good of citizens and society in general. So that's the kind of rationale that we have behind it.
Thank you. Yoichi, did you have anything you wanted to add, or shall we? keep on moving.
I should avoid repeating the same comment.
Okay, sounds good. Just a reminder for those folks that are in the audience that we are taking questions. So if you have a question that you would like to ask any of our panelists, please feel free to drop it in the chat. We're haven't seen any yet, but happy to answer them if you do have any. Yoichi, maybe a question for you. You did reference a lot of the work that has been ongoing in G7, G20, OECD, and given your role in those multilateral fora, would be interested to hear a little bit more about whether you see those fora as, particularly good places to have meaningful discussions on AI governments, and maybe share your views on how those forums can be most appropriately leveraged as we move forward and figuring out, what the right approach to AI governance is in different countries around the world.
Okay, thank you very much. Actually, as I said in the beginning, G7 and the G20 discussions were a little bit, slowing down after we agreed on the AI principles in G20. But I think it's time to discuss how to implement these principles at the governmental level again, especially after we saw the proposal by the EU on AI regulation. So I hope this agenda of each round is set by a presidency country, and next year we will have Germany for G7 and Indonesia for G20. We need to discuss with those presidencies, but I hope we can start again the deeper discussion on how to implement AI principles. And at OECD, we are promoting the continuous discussion at 3 different working groups, and one of them is discussing classification of AI systems, which are trying to classify the AI systems on the basis of input data, output services, and also the types of algorithms, and also the differences of context the AI systems are used in. So I think this will be very much useful when we judge and evaluate the risks and the benefit depending on the situation where the AI systems are used. So I share the comment, there is no one size fit all solution, but there can be a kind of deeper understanding from those discussions and analysis. And I hope these platforms are very much useful for policymakers and all other stakeholders to understand AI deeper in the next coming years. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Yoichi. Appreciate that. Jose, yeah.
Yeah, we do agree, Ichi. And one thing that we did here in Brazil, and it's working very well, is we are from government, right? So I am engineer. My background is electrical engineer. I studied at 25, 30 years ago, something that today is the AI, and that time was another thing, Boolean algebra and so on. But when we think about the real cooperation, defining the protocol, define standards and so on, and how to approach some specific technical issues, we need to ask the ecosystem in the country to work with you. So what we did is we established a national AI network. We bring the main R&D centers and universities. We bring the companies and put everyone together. And we set study groups in specific issues. And then we are getting these specialists and sending them, representing Brazil on the subgroups on JPI, for instance. So they can really discuss technically and support the development of the technology worldwide. That's just one thing that we did. And then they bring the feedback to us to improve and to evaluate the public policy. That's what they're doing today.
Great, thank you both for elaborating on that work. Agree that those multilateral forests sound like good areas to have these more in-depth discussions on some of this. I have gotten 2 more questions. I know we are running up against the hour here, so we'll try to get to both, but if not, maybe to ask what Marco had put in the chat about what key next steps are to take in the short and medium term in order to ensure more global cooperation and avoid divergence. If you have any specific thoughts about key next steps, that might be a good way to kind of wrap up our discussion today. So welcome views from any of our panelists on that.
I will be selfish and I say, I welcome and encourage all participations at AI risk management framework. I want to second what we heard about going from principles to practice, and that's exactly what we're doing. So we're trying to, in development of the risk management framework, we're hoping to engage researchers that help us to develop the metrics and methods that we need. Standard development organizations to develop standards for understanding, assessing, and also the Nist and other places to set up evaluations and test beds and benchmarks to actually do those testing. So there are plenty forums and methods for research. We call them pre-standardization research. So we make sure that standards are developed technically sound. Again, we welcome and encourage participation in the AI risk management framework and standard development organizations.
Thanks, Elham. Anyone else?
So maybe just a comment. I mean, international standardization organizations do play a role here, and of course, cooperation there is something that could be beneficial to all parties involved. And that could be a way of ensuring a certain degree of alignment, and that's what they exist for, of course, and that is something where I think like-minded countries and organizations can then work together to achieve results which bring things to forward in a way which is useful and not too fragmented. And of course, there are other forms for cooperation. GPA was mentioned here, for example, which can also help to build consensus on certain things, and a number of others. But those are the kinds of, let me see, 2 aspects which are important in this regard. Thank you.
Thanks. Do any of our other panelists want to weigh in, or?
Yeah, may I?
Please.
I strongly support Yuka's comment and also Elham's. We need to collaborate and communicate with each other among like-minded partners, and also with multi-stakeholders, because there are some groups, some people who are trying to use this technology with malicious intention, and we need to prevail the good human-centric use and the deployment of this technology around the world, and that is the common agenda for us. And so I think we need to closely collaborate and closely communicate, and there must be some differences between from country to country, community to community, but among like-minded countries and among like-minded democratic partners, we need to collaborate all together.
Thank you.
I do agree with my colleagues. We have to collaborate. Of course, there are the specificities, you know what I mean.
Specificity, got it. Yeah.
But one thing that we're putting in mind that's looking to this specifically is the semantic library. We need to have some semantic library for at the least at the end of the day, the AI training will be more similar. I will have the technology, I have the AI training. And then the knowledge that one country gets can be used in another one, because you have standards on the language that the AI will try to speak on each other. So this is challenging, because when you think about training AI on Japanese or in English or in Portuguese, is very different. And the size of the library of the language are very different today. US English language is very big, very huge. In Brazil, our semantic are very small. So we have to think how to do this together. And a health application in Japan can be used in Brazil and also in US to avoid a triple work on try to train in the same process in many countries. Try to do a very unique way to do this together would be very fruitful to have a best approach on some specific application. So it's challenging. I know that's challenging, but it's one thing that I have put in mind.
All right, well, thank you everyone for that. I think that was a good question for us to close on. I would like to thank everyone for participating in our panel today. Thank you to our audience members for joining. Again, we really appreciate all of you being here today, and we'll look forward to continuing the conversation on AI as I think will only continue to get a little bit more challenging, especially as we see countries kind of thinking about things moving forward. So thanks again, everyone, and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you
Thank you very much indeed.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you. Bye-bye.